Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi everybody, welcome to this week's Art of Procurement interview. I'm here at the SIG Spring Summit conference in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be joined today by Danny Ertel. Danny is the founding partner of Vantage Partners. His practice focuses on negotiating and managing strategic relationships, in particular those involving complex and professional services. So Danny's co-authored 4 books and also served as a researcher at the Harvard Negotiation Project. So there's a lot more that I could pick out of your bio as well, Danny, but I just wanted to welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you. It's good to be here.
And thanks for joining me. And you trained as a lawyer. You have a JD from Harvard Law School. How did you end up getting involved in procurement?
A long and winding road, right? First, I have not practiced law, I think, now since 1989.
Right.
And I usually ask people not to hold it against me that I started out as a lawyer. It was in law school that I met Roger Fisher at the Harvard Negotiation Project and got very interested in ways to bring people together to solve problems. And some of the problems that we help our clients solve at Vantage have to do with supply chain problems, whether they are relationships with suppliers or they are relationships with stakeholders that we need to align in order to be more effective externally. But we also do work on strategic alliances, so we do a fair amount of work in the pharmaceutical sector, on the business development, go-to-market, joint R&D side. And we also do work on the front of the house, so we help some companies with their key client relationships.
Right. So as you progress through your career journey, is there some fundamental perspectives or beliefs that perhaps have shaped your philosophy or kind of the way that you go about the work that you do?
Gosh, there's probably a handful, but one that I actually talked about yesterday in one of the sessions that I was doing on alignment and on stakeholder engagement is that the more convinced you are that somebody is just dead wrong and that they are crazy, evil, or stupid, the more you cut yourself off from avenues for some kind of a solution. And if you can just sort of force that little voice in your head that says, oh my God, they're crazy or whatnot, or why, to get a little bit curious about why they believe what they believe, because most people do what they think makes sense, at least for them. The better you understand why something makes sense for them, the better chance you have to influence that.
Is there like a specific line of questioning that you can take to understand that? Is there a science to it, I guess, for the want of a better word?
So some of it is just about finding how to get yourself in that space where you get curious. And instead of rejecting, to really just ask people to tell me more is one of my favorite questions. Tell me a little bit about what success looks like. Where are you trying to go with that? I'm Cuban and my first language is Spanish. And in Spanish, there's 2 very different ways to ask the question why. There is a why as in sort of kind of the causal version of why. Why are you saying that? But there's also why as in the for what purpose. So there's the porque and the para qué. And I find that's a very useful distinction because when you ask somebody why, they can sometimes get a little defensive.
Right, so it's more the inquisitive why.
Right. But if you ask them sort of for what purpose, what are you trying to accomplish, where are you trying to go with this, you often find something that they're interested in that you can then say, well, I don't disagree with that, so let's figure out what are the different ways to get there.
I see. So you have a common ground, you're building a common ground with them first, and then looking at what the points of differences are.
It's a little bit easier when you have some kind of common ground, even if that we're both vexed by the same problem. And sitting across the table from each other and arguing about it is not as productive as putting the problem on the wall and both looking at it and saying, what do we do about it?
Right, trying to break it down a little bit. I know that you're involved, and you mentioned it a little bit in the intro, in fixing broken relationships. I wonder is there a particular approach that you take, or are there flags that you look for that help you determine what the best approach is to fix a relationship that may be broken? Or is it really very, very much a it's a single approach for a single problem, and you kind of got to change it up every time that you approach a problem a relationship that's broken.
Yeah, I mean, I could go to the usual consultant's answer, right? It depends.
Mm-hmm.
But there's certainly some similarities, right? And when you look at an outsourcing relationship that is underperforming, or you look at any other kind of supplier relationship that is not working well, or any kind of business partnership that's not working well, you can usually run through a little bit of a checklist of, right, is that the problem is that our objectives are out of alignment. Either they weren't ever aligned, or something has changed for one of us, and we no longer want the same things, or the things that we thought we wanted. You can look a little bit at the other end of the spectrum. It's not the business problem that has changed. There's something about the personalities, the relationship, the interpersonal dynamics. And there are some folks who are in the relationship remediation business that jump straight to it's all about, let's do a deep dive in your psyche and figure out. I tend not to go there. I tend to really look at sort of the spectrum in between and say, is there something about the process? Is there something about what we're measuring? Is there something about the mandate that people have or the role they think they're carrying out? And I look to see, can we clean up some of those things? And if we clean up some of those things, often what presents as a personality conflict tends to diminish or resolve itself. One of the stickiest things, one of the most common causes of conflict in supplier relationships has to do with decision-making rights. And people who believe that they have veto power over something when what you were asking them was for input. People who you thought needed to be consulted on something, and therefore you showed them something and were waiting for feedback, and they just thought you were informing them, and therefore they don't respond at all, and you feel disrespected. So a little bit of clarification. We use a tool that is similar to RACI, but a little bit more optimized around decision-making, that helps clarify what some of those roles and rights are with respect to decisions. And that cleans up a lot of the feelings of I'm being disrespected, I'm not being taken into account, you're ignoring me, or conversely, I went to get input from you and you didn't respond, you're not really bought in, you're not really engaged.
So do you find that fundamentally the issues are typically, I know there's, again, a spectrum of what the root causes are of broken relationships. Is it more that it's something that either could have been mitigated up front, and it's more contractual? It's more about what a buyer wants now versus what a buyer wanted 3 years ago, and how things have changed within the organization versus it's two people who just don't get on with each other?
So I think it's actually not either of those, but in these supplier relationships where we're not just sort of buying widgets and paying for them, but we're actually trying to do something together afterwards. We have to implement something. The root cause of a lot of those problems are back in how the deal was negotiated in the first place. And people treat the negotiation as this whole separate event that happens on another planet, and all the gloves come off, and anything is fair game. And they take shortcuts, and they leave things undefined because it's too hard to agree on them now.
We'll figure it out later.
And later it turns out that we've got a real problem. People who needed to implement the deal didn't provide input because the deal makers were keeping it all under, a cone of silence, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think this is such an issue. I ended up writing a whole book about this 10 years ago. But it's not a new problem. It's not a novel problem. But it comes a little bit from the separation between who gets the deals done and then who has to live with them.
How do you guide, I think this is particularly important from my experience, at least in renegotiations. So perhaps there's a renegotiation because a contract has ended, but more often it's because there's been an acknowledgement that something has changed within the agreement, and maybe you're 3 years into a 5-year deal, let's say, and there's a desire to renegotiate that existing deal. But there's always a risk then of how you approach that then filtering through into the relationship once that negotiation is, or once that new contract or updated contract has been signed. And I feel from experience, those are situations that I've been in as well, that negotiating teams then take a very kind of aggressive perspective, irrespective of relationship, and then expect the day that a contract is signed everybody's happy again, and kind of you forget what went on in the middle. I just wondered how you advise or guide clients in terms of how they think about negotiating with the same people that they're then expected to continue the relationship, as a big happy family for, once that contract has been re-signed.
I mean, I think that it helps to have the reality and the expectation of continuity, because if you have to live with these people after you're done negotiating, you are thinking about what it's going to be like to implement, and you're taking that into account. The bigger problems happen when we silo the functions and the negotiators just negotiate deals, and then they go on to the next deal and the next deal and don't retain any ownership and implementation. But I think that there's a lot of things that can go into your strategy, whether it's for a negotiation or a renegotiation, that communicate certain things about what you expect from the future relationship, right? So we have advised clients who are very dependent, for example, on a sole source supplier. One case I'm thinking about, it was $5 billion a year relationship, very dependent. The board said, it's too much of a risk to be this dependent. We have to diversify some of our spend. The supply chain team was really nervous about going into this negotiation because they thought there's no way that they're going to take it well. They're going to react badly. Service levels are going to suffer. Our costs are going to go up. This is going to be problematic.
There's more risk to actually do something than to stay with the status quo.
Exactly. And part of what we helped them do was put together a strategy where they could go to that supplier and say, look, it is a risk and diversification question. It's got nothing to do with trying to attack you, to hurt you, to cause you any damage.
Penalize in any way.
Let's work together on some other revenue opportunities for you, some other PR opportunities for you. We can reconfirm our commitment to the work that we do together so that the street won't take this as we're pulling market share from you. Let's figure out a way to have you benefit in some way or make you whole. But we do need to be able to diversify. And I remember the head of the supply chain was going to have a meeting with the CEO of the supplier, and he told us about the story where he sat on the other side of the desk from the guy, and there was I can't give too many details, but there was a photograph on the wall. And the supply chain head said, "Oh, that's a picture of your first truck, isn't it?" And he said, "Oh yeah, we have a great partnership with that trucking company and so forth." It's like, so you only buy that kind of truck? He says, "Oh no, we couldn't possibly, right?" And so he kind of made the point of it's not that you don't have a great relationship with a supplier. It's just that in this day and age, you can't be entirely dependent.
It's just it's not good business to have a small number of essentially blockages or points of failure within your organization. You're in a great position through your work to see a lot of what goes on in procurement, to watch the evolution of procurement. Where are we headed?
It's been interesting to sort of see, sort of as the economy has changed, how procurement has changed, right? And sort of the emphasis that has changed from tangible assets to intangible assets in the market value of companies, right? Some of the most valuable companies in the world own very little in the way of tangible assets. Procurement has been and will continue to evolve from buying goods to services to solutions to innovation. And you need different approaches, right? And you need different skill sets. And you operate under a somewhat different paradigm when you're sourcing innovation than when you're sourcing commodities. And I think that procurement organizations are having to adapt to that. Partly because some of the quote-unquote easier stuff, the more transactional stuff, is getting automated. And so, but that frees people up to have different kinds of relationships with certain suppliers in order to help the organization in a different way.
Do you think that there's, when I think of the procurement value proposition, how the procurement value proposition is evolving, are there parts of the value proposition that we don't even see yet? So as you talk about automation, obviously taking away a lot of the the stuff that takes time that's not particularly value added, or that it can drive insights that add value later, but it's not stuff that's immediately adding to our value prop, essentially. As we think about supporting innovation, as an example, as when we think of our vision of how to move the profession, I just wonder sometimes if we still see ourselves with this glass ceiling, and we're maybe not thinking high enough in terms of the potential impact that procurement can have. And I just wondered if you had an opinion on that.
Yeah, so among our clients, the ones that are a little bit more forward-thinking, their aspiration for the supply chain organization and for procurement is to add competitive advantage to the company, right? There are some organizations that say, no, our job is to save some costs.
Yeah.
Some say it's to be a check and balance on the business so that the business doesn't get too crazy. But the more forward-looking leaders are saying, no, we need to add competitive advantage. And that's going to sometimes come in the form of revenue opportunities that were driven from the supply chain. Some of it is going to come in the leveraging of assets and capabilities that our suppliers have that we don't need to have because we can get the benefit of theirs. But that requires thinking about, so what do I want from my supplier? What kind of a relationship do I need? How am I going to treat them? Do I recognize they need to make money too? They have business objectives they're trying to meet.
As you look at those, as you think about those clients in your mind, are there things that differentiate them in terms of perhaps the skills that they value, or how they kind of create a culture that enables their teams to perhaps think differently and kind of approach things with a different mindset?
Yeah, so one of sort of the key competencies that we're seeing supply chain leaders try to develop in their people is strategic thinking. And so it is not just do the analytics, find the right mix, identify the right suppliers, but it's think 2, 3, 4 steps ahead. Think backwards from the objective the business is trying to accomplish and say, if the business is trying to get over there, then what are the things that the supply chain can do to help the business get there better, faster, cheaper? And in doing so, you need supply chain and procurement personnel who are able to think strategically. The other big piece that's necessary is they need to be able to engage their stakeholders, right? They need to bring their stakeholders along, to influence their stakeholders, to not be relegated to the guys and gals who cut the SOW and get the PO done, right?
So as you think about your stakeholders, I have a couple of questions, one that may actually go back on a previous answer that you gave, but I want to stick with stakeholders and building alignment with stakeholders. And you mentioned that you talked about that, I think, yesterday here at the SIG conference. I just wonder if you could share any best practices or perhaps guidance, advice, or counsel that you give to procurement professionals who are wanting to build stronger relationships with their stakeholders and become more aligned with their stakeholders.
So first it starts a little bit with the realization that if we want a seat at the table and if we want to have a real role, then we can't just rely on getting a mandate from above. Because for a long time procurement has said we need a mandate. Often the things we have to do to get the mandate can come back to bite us. So one of the things we talked about in the session is how procurement sometimes gets that mandate by by committing to some savings with the CFO. But then the CFO says, that's great, but if those savings are real, then I'm going to take them and move them to the bottom line. Well, what that means is the business unit doesn't get the benefit of the savings. They don't get to do more with their budgets. They just have less budget.
They're actually, they don't have the reason to want to work with you because it's just going to have budget taken away from them.
Exactly. You've made them go through the trouble of bringing new suppliers up to speed on the business, working with them, creating some risk from the execution perspective, and they haven't gotten anything to show for it. So sometimes the things we do to get the mandate actually worsen the relationship with the business. Second, even if we have a mandate, the business can comply with the mandate and still bring us in late just to tidy up after they've done a lot. And when we come in late, the only thing we can do is fiddle about with a little bit of pricing and some of the T's and C's. And guess what? When that's all we do, that just confirms the business's view that that's all we're good for. So again, I worry a little bit about relying too much on the mandate. I think instead, procurement needs to really understand who are the stakeholders that they should be engaging, who cares about this, who's going to benefit, who's going to be impacted by whatever it is that we're trying to do or solve. We need to take the time to understand where they sit in the organization, what the relationships are among the stakeholders. One of the things I spent time with yesterday was teaching people a simple tool for stakeholder mapping, which helps you understand not just who are the stakeholders and are they for you or against you, but how do they influence each other? And then it serves a little bit as a little bit of a bus map to figure out how do I navigate, and how do I get from point A to point B and bring along as many of the stakeholders that I need to bring with me.
And it's kind of influencing directly some of those stakeholders as well, as you see connections, and then using advocates to help you strengthen relationships in areas that you may not have strong relationships.
Exactly. And often we step in it inadvertently because we reach out to the people closest to us and most likely to agree with us. And if they are the kind of stakeholder that then some other important stakeholder, when they say white, they say black, then we've set ourselves up for a problem we didn't need to.
One of the other things I think is interesting as we think about stakeholders is we have a typical a kind of approach of looking at it based on spend. What I interviewed probably a couple of years now ago, the team at Google, and they shared with me their approach in terms of, they look at it like an airline loyalty program almost, platinum stakeholders, gold, silver, bronze stakeholders, but it's not aligned with how much money they spend. Yes, that's one of the considerations, but it's their role as a stakeholder in terms of the strategic importance of their job and what they're working on to the future of the company. So they can be working on moonshots, they can be working on some relatively small dollar value projects, but the company is putting a lot of importance on those in terms of creating competitive advantage. So thinking about where those people reside rather than just going to your spend analysis and saying, okay, these are my top 50 suppliers, who are the stakeholders aligned with those?
Right. I mean, I think you have to segment your suppliers according to more than just how much we spend with them, and you have to segment your stakeholders by more than just how much they spend.
How important is the notion of customer of choice? So I have strong opinions. I'm going to hold them, but listeners of the show will know, broadly speaking, I'm very pro it. But I also speak to people who are more, we spend the money where the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and what we say kind of goes. I just love your perspective on should we and how far should we be going in becoming a customer of choice and thinking about the broader relationship rather than just it being a one-way relationship.
So don't get me started, because 2 summits ago I gave the closing keynote on becoming customer of choice and why it's important. I do think that companies today are competing with some of their peers, right, for access to the best talent, for access to the best ideas, for getting the most that their suppliers can put forward. Right, so if you think about sort of who our suppliers' other customers are, they're usually our competitors. And if we think of the role of the supply chain in providing competitive advantage, we have to think a little bit about how do we get the best suppliers to want to work with us, not just by overpaying them. How do we get them, once they're working with us, to give us their best people, to bring us their best ideas first, to be willing to co-invest on our platforms and in the things that are important to us. And that has to do with how we work with them, how we treat them. Not just at the personal level, right? It's not just offer them coffee when they come to a site visit. But it's sharing roadmap information, is helping them understand where we're going. It's bringing them a little bit more inside the tent. Now, you can't do that with every supplier.
Is there an approach that you use to figure out which suppliers you should be focusing on those kind of relationships?
There's a couple of different approaches to supplier segmentation, and I usually do a little bit of iterating and titrating between the two. But one of them is to be very by the numbers and define a set of criteria, and then try to collect the data and apply the criteria. The other one is very much of a gut check about, which suppliers would really make a difference to our business, either in the positive way or in a negative way. if the relationship went to hell.
Yeah.
And there's often some good alignment between if you have a decent segmentation model, what the numbers are telling you and what your gut and your stakeholders' gut is telling them. The one caution I would make about the by the numbers approach, I have seen segmentation models with 19 criteria that are used for putting suppliers in one of 3 categories.
Yeah.
And you don't need 19 criteria to decide in which of 3 categories does the supplier belong. So the other thing you have to do when you're sort of testing whether your segmentation model makes sense is to take a look and say, so the suppliers that are in this bucket, what are the consequences or the implications of being in that bucket? How do we treat them differently? Yeah. Does that make sense given their characteristics? And sometimes we find actually 60% of our criteria have nothing to do with how we would treat a supplier differently. It's like, well, why are those criteria then for segmentation?
Right. How much importance when you're thinking about which suppliers to try and build those deeper kind of customer of choice relationships with, how much do you take into account their existing relationship with you? Whether, we have a good relationship, so it's going to be quote unquote easier to bring them into to have that kind of relationship, or they're actually a supplier that we have a not a very good relationship with, but are very important to us, and so that's a risk to us. So we should be thinking about how we change that relationship.
Yeah. So I think you have to walk before you run, and you need to, anytime you're going to undertake sort of an incremental change to your SRM program or your customer of choice program, you have to pilot it. You have to try it out. And generally, I advise clients to, take somebody from column A and somebody from column B, and that way you have a real pilot, right? Yeah. And you understand a little bit, what does it take to transform a relationship that's not performing really well? Yeah. And what does it take to manage one that is actually doing pretty well? Just like within those relationships, you have to think a little bit about, so why is this supplier in my highest tier with the most differentiated touches and handling? Right. Is it because their value proposition to us is moonshots, or their value proposition is best in class pricing and geographic coverage or something, right? And you have to take those things into account as well.
So I just, as we start to wrap up, have a final question that I think brings together both building customer of choice relationships with also building alliances within the organization, bringing stakeholders and having that alignment. I wonder, based on your experience, what you've seen to be most successful in kind of bringing stakeholders along when they may have a negative perspective of a particular supplier. And we've seen, stakeholders who they hate their supplier, they want nothing to do with them except for what's in the contract, they want to get rid of them in 3 years or whatever it may be. But you recognize that that's a big risk to the organization, and so we actually want to strengthen the relationship, and that person as a stakeholder may be an inhibitor to doing that. I wonder if there's any approaches or kind of typical ways that you look at bringing a stakeholder along so that as an organization you're not kind of inhibited by just that one person's relationship with a stakeholder as you seek to build a stronger relationship.
I think it's partly about understanding why that stakeholder is having such a hard time with that supplier, but it is sometimes playing a little bit of an intermediary role or a coaching role. So we're doing some work right now with a mining company, and the procurement person was describing to us a situation where they'd had a supplier who had a significant safety failure. Yeah. And safety is a huge part of the culture at this mining company, as you might imagine. And the stakeholder involved is a stakeholder who has a reputation for, bringing suppliers in, reading them a riot act, berating them, yelling, throwing things. Yeah. And so she did a pretty brave thing, right? So she brought the stakeholder and the supplier representative together in the room, and she started out by asking the supplier for some feedback on the incident and some of the factors around it. And that sort of surprised the supplier a little bit because he was expecting to come in and, be taken out to the woodshed. Yeah. And he shared some really useful information. And that got the stakeholder to say, well, I hadn't heard some of those things before. And if that were true, what could we do about it and how could we see it coming? And they had a very productive dialogue.
Yeah.
And when they came out of that meeting, she said the stakeholder turned to her and said, well, that was different and useful.
Yeah.
So sometimes just leading the way, asking the question differently, framing the problem differently can help even a tough stakeholder look at it.
Yeah, and I guess attempting to get all the facts out in the open rather than going in with your assumptions and making decisions or calls or comments based on your assumption.
If my purpose is to penalize you and I go collecting all the supporting facts that justify the penalty, it's a very different conversation than if my purpose is to figure out why this happened so it doesn't happen again. And you ask different questions and you listen for different things.
Yeah. Well, Danny, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I just have one final question, and I say in all my pods, this is the easiest question, and that's just if any listeners would like to find out a little bit more, connect with you, find out about Vantage Partners, where would be the best place for them to go?
So as we were chatting right before the interview started, we're in the process of rebranding and launching a new website effective next month. But the current one is still there, contact information, lots of white papers, lots of background. So it's www.vantagepartners.com. I am on LinkedIn. I am on the website, so I'm easy to find.
All right, great. Well, what I'll do is I'll include those links on the show notes page for today's episode. That's going to be at artofprocurement.com/vantagepartners. That's artofprocurement.com/vantagepartners. Danny, one last time, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.